morning everyone. So in this lesson, I will discuss about the element exposed hazard. Elements to expose hazard. It's a genetic term that signifies everything that might be exposed to hazard, ranging from buildings to the economy and from individual person to communities. Element at risk, including and the followings. Number 1. Human beings. People are the most important elements at risk during a disaster. Their safety, health, and lives are at stake. The dwellings are household and communities. Homes and communities are vulnerable to damage or destruction during disasters, such as earthquakes, flood, or wildfires. Number 3. Buildings and structures. This including commercial buildings, school, hospital, factories, and other structures that can be damaged or destroyed during a disaster event. Public facilitate and infrastructure assets. Public utilities transportation system, road, bridge, power plants, water treatment plants, and other infrastructure elements are at risk during disaster. Public and transport system. This includes public transportation system like buses, trains, and airport, as well as highway and other transportation networks. Agricultural commodities such as farmers, crop, livestock, and agricultural infrastructures are at risk during a disaster, such as hurricanes, droughts, or pest outbreaks. Environmental assets as natural resources, ecosystem, and biodiversity can be damaged or lost during disaster, causing long-term environmental impacts. Various elements exposed to hazard. Number 1. Physical hazard is defined as a factor within the environment that can harm the body. Necessarily touch it. Example, vibration and noisy. Number 2. Cultural hazard, also known as social hazard, result from your location, socio-economic status, occupation, and behavioral choice. Number 3. Economic hazard refers to major natural disaster which can and do have served negative short-term economics impact. Number 4. Environmental hazard refers to state or event which has the potential to threaten the surrounding natural environment and adversely affect people's health.
Lesson 2. Elements at risk and exposed to hazard. Vulnerability to specific hazards can stem from a range of factors encompassing physical, social, economic, and environmental aspects. Some examples of vulnerability include poor design and construction of buildings and infrastructure, inadequate structural integrity, and failure to adhere to safety standards can increase vulnerability to hazards such as earthquakes, hurricanes, or floods. Inadequate protection of measures for assets. Insufficient safeguards such as lack of flood barriers or fire suppression system can leave assets and infrastructure include damage or destruction. Lack of public information and awareness. Limited access to accurate and timely information about potential hazard and appropriate response measures can hinder preparedness and increase vulnerability. Limited official recognition of risks and preparedness measures. Inadequate recognition of prioritization of risks by authorities can result in insufficient allocation of resources for preparedness and mitigation efforts. Disregarding for wise environmental management. Neglecting sustainable land use practices, deforestation, or improper waste management can exacerbate the impacts of hazard, such as landslide or pollution-related incidents. These vulnerabilities highlights the importance of implementing measures that address these factors, such as improving infrastructure, resilience, enhancing public education and awareness campaigns, and promoting sustainable environmental practices. By addressing these vulnerabilities, communities can better prepare for and mitigate the impacts of specific hazards. ADPC stands for. ADPC stands for the Asian Disaster Preparedness Center. It is a non-profit organization based in Bangkok, Thailand that specializes in disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, and emergency management. ADPC works with governments, organizations, and communities across the Asia-Pacific region to build resilience and enhance preparedness from natural disaster and other hazards. So now let's move on to the four main types of vulnerability. There are four main types of vulnerability that are commonly discussed in the context of disaster risk reduction and vulnerability assessments. Number 1. Physical vulnerability. Physical vulnerability refers to susceptibility of physical infrastructure, buildings, and systems to damage or destruction caused by natural or man-made hazard. This includes factors such as quality of construction, structural integrity, and exposure to hazards like earthquake, floods, or storms. Number 2. Social vulnerability. Social vulnerability relates to the characteristic and circumstances of individuals and communities that make them more susceptible to the impacts of hazard. This can include factors such as poverty, inequality, limited access to resources and services, social marginalization, and inadequate social support system. Number 3. Economic vulnerability. Economic vulnerability refers to the susceptibility of individuals, households, and communities to economic losses and disruptions resulting from hazards. These include factors such as income levels, employment opportunities, economic diversification, access to financial resources, and resilience of economic sectors such to shocks. Number 4. Environmental vulnerability. Environmental vulnerability focus on the susceptibility of ecosystem and the natural environment to degradation or disruption caused by hazards. These include factors such as deforestation, loss of biodiversity, degradation of coastal areas, and climate change impacts, which can increase the vulnerability of communities reliant on this ecosystem. Understanding and addressing these different types of vulnerability is crucial for effective disaster risk reduction and resilience building efforts. By addressing the underlying factors contributing to vulnerability, it is possible to enhance the capacity of individuals, communities, and systems to withstand and recover from the impacts of hazards.
Risk factors refer to the characteristics or condition that increase the likelihood or severity of a particular event or outcome. In the context of disaster risk reduction and vulnerability assessment, risk factors are factors that contribute to the vulnerability of individuals, communities, or systems to hazards. Here are some examples of risk factors. Population density. High population density in urban areas can increase the risk of casualties and damage during disasters. Overcrowding and inadequate infrastructure can exacerbate the impacts of hazards. Number 5. Environmental degradation. Environmental degradation such as deforestation. Environmental factors such as deforestation, soil erosion, and loss of biodiversity can increase the vulnerability to natural hazards. Degraded ecosystems are less able to absorb and mitigate the impacts of hazards. Number 6. Lack of preparedness and awareness. Insufficient knowledge, awareness, and preparedness for hazard can increase the risk of harm and hinder effective response and recovery efforts. Identifying and addressing these risk factors is essential for developing effective risk reduction strategies, improving resilience, and minimizing the impacts of hazard on individuals, communities, and systems. Understanding the elements at risk under exposure to hazards is crucial for assessing the potential impacts of hazards, developing risk reduction strategies, and implementing measures to enhance resilience. By identifying and prioritizing these elements, appropriate action can be taken to mitigate the potential consequences of hazard events. diagram of disaster risk is a conceptual framework that illustrates the interrelationship between three key components of disaster risk: hazard, vulnerability, and exposure. It provides a visual representation of how these components interact to determine the level of risk associated with a particular hazards. The hazard component represents the potential occurrence of a natural or man-made event that can cause harm or damage. This can include hazards such as earthquakes, floods, hurricanes, wildfires, or industrial accidents. Hazard can vary in terms of their frequency, intensity, and spatial extent. Vulnerability. The vulnerability component refers to the characteristics and circumstances that make individuals, communities, or systems susceptible to the impacts of a hazard. This includes factors such as socioeconomic conditions, access to resources and services, governance structure, and the ability to cope and recover from a disaster. Exposure. The exposure component represents the elements at risk that are exposed to the potential impact of a hazard. This includes human populations, buildings, infrastructure, natural resources, and economic assets that are located within the hazard-prone area. The level of exposure depends on the spatial distribution and the density of these elements. The diagram illustrates that disaster risk is not solely determined by the hazard itself, but rather by the combination of hazard, vulnerability, and exposure. By understanding and addressing each component, it is possible to reduce the overall risk and enhance resilience to disasters. This framework is widely used in disaster risk reduction and management to guide risk assessment, planning, and decision-making processes.